So this is actually part of a series called Ed Talks at the College of Education. We bring in both internal speakers, so faculty who are on faculty at the college, as well as external speakers that we recruit to come and speak to people here at the college event. So we have flyers around the room if we want to check out who else we have coming in the future. So today we have Dr. Liliana Garces presenting to us. So she is an associate professor in the program, and she's also an affiliate of the University of Texas School of Law. She joined our program this fall, so she's early on in her tenure here. So before she was here, she worked on the faculty at Pennsylvania State University and George Washington University. Prior to that, she also worked as a civil rights lawyer and a judicial law clerk in federal district court. So she teaches the courses on higher ed law in our program, along with equity and diversity in higher education. She is presenting work for us today that examines the implications of colorblind and race-neutral policies and practices at a public flagship institution.
Thanks, Lauren. Well, thank you everyone for being here. It's really wonderful to see you all. Today I'm going to be speaking on a study that's forthcoming in Teachers College Record later in the year. We'll see, the queue is pretty long. And this was actually a project that I started with a graduate research assistant at my former institution a couple years ago when we first started the project, and we're co-authors on the article, and that's very exciting for me. He's now an assistant professor, and that's also really exciting. Before I go into talking about the project, I'll start by just saying a little bit about myself. And then I anticipate speaking for about maybe just 30 minutes or so that we can have plenty of time for Q&A. All right, so as my partner likes to remind me, I'm a recovering lawyer. It's true. Before I went into education, I had practiced as a civil rights lawyer for about 5 years before then going back to grad school and undergoing my socialization and learning how to think like a researcher and having the privilege of now merging those two things in the work that I do. And in 2002, when I was working for the American Civil Liberties Union, we had a case that made it to the Supreme Court. It had to do with the constitutional rights of immigrants who were in deportation proceedings, as they were called at the time. This is what the court looked like at the time. You can see Chief Justice Rehnquist in the middle, Justice O'Connor, and a few other members who are no longer on the court. Now, for those of you who might be curious, this is what the court looks like now. Very exciting to see Justice Sotomayor and 3 women. So I'm going to take you back to this time in 2002. I have very vivid memories still of sitting at counsel's table, not very far from all these 9 justices. They're about as far as you are from me. And my co-counsel, Judy, was arguing with Chief Justice Rehnquist at the time about the constitutional rights of immigrants. And just that moment was so vivid for me. It was so intense, especially when I thought about the journey that brought me there, right? So going back, I immigrated when I was about 12 years old from Colombia, South America, with my mom, single at the time. We made the journey without documents. We had very little resources. I didn't speak any English at the time. And thinking about those beginnings to sitting before the highest court in the nation, defending the constitutional rights of other immigrants, was something that to me represented the best that education has to offer, right? Open opportunities, help you realize your highest aspirations. But we know that that's not the case for a lot of students of color in our country. Education actually serves to further entrench inequities, to close doors of opportunity. And it was after that experience that I really wanted to dedicate the next stage of my career to working to help education serve that former role of opening opportunities as opposed to entrenching inequities in our society. And that is something that, in terms of how I approach my work, let's just take a minute here, focus on this again. Just the motivation, I bring certain underlying assumptions to my work. And that is that individuals from all race and ethnicities should be the ones that are shaping and making the policies that affect all of us. Yet we also know, and my apologies, I have to come back here to advance the clicker, that when we look at the composition of individuals in positions of power and influence, it's predominantly white. These are just some of the figures. The other thing that we know is that a degree from a selective institution is something that provides that pathway to those positions of power in our society. Yet, when we look at the composition by race and ethnicity of undergraduate students at the various tiers of institutions, they are underrepresented at those tiers of high selective four-year institutions. So if we look at the top right, relative to their makeup in the demographics of the US, students of color are highly underrepresented. Now that's a underrepresentation that is partly due to legacies of racial discrimination, right? It relates to lack of access to high quality education, to social networks. And it goes back to having policies that go back to racial discrimination, right? That explains why students of color are underrepresented, disproportionately represented at these high tiers of selective institutions. And we know that access to those institutions really matters. They provide a lot of resources with respect to financial aid, faculty attention, access to social networks to help you navigate those spaces of power and influence, better market labor returns. So for all students who go on and obtain a four-year degree, we know that there's higher earnings. But this is specifically the case for Latino and African American students. Causal studies demonstrate that that is the case. And as I've mentioned, it leads to employment in these important areas of influence. We've got graduate schools, firms, business, recruiting from these places. It signals equality, right? So one of the policies in higher education that has been implemented to provide access to these institutions has been affirmative action, right? A policy that started back in 1960s in the employment context. And the original goal, the intent, was to ensure equal access and to level the playing field for African Americans who'd been oppressed under slavery and government enforced segregation. And these are the words by President Lyndon Johnson at a very famous speech at Howard University. Now, we also know that that's a policy that's been subject to a lot of controversy. A lot of legal cases have shaped that original intent of affirmative action. So the legal cases going back to the Bakke case in the mid-1970s, to then affirmative action cases, challenges at the University of Michigan, the Grutter v. Bollinger, Gratz v. Bollinger in 2003. And most recently, here at our institution, the challenge brought by Abigail Fisher at UT. And all these cases have shaped the rationale, the intent of affirmative action in a way that's really changed it. It has shifted it from this prior intent. What those cases have done is that they've changed the definition and the implementation of affirmative action at institutions of higher education. And they've done that in two ways. First, they've changed the goal, the reason why we can have it. They've said to institutions, you cannot use this policy to address racial discrimination. It is not permitted under an interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. What you can do is think about the future benefits, the educational benefits of diversity. Now, research has really documented a lot of those benefits. It leads, when you have a racially and ethnically diverse student body, it leads to improved critical thinking skills. It can help reduce stereotypes, improve cross-racial understanding. It better prepares students for a multiracial society to be better leaders in our diverse society. That's important. But when it comes to addressing the ongoing effects of past racial discrimination and ongoing and current racial discrimination, it's not something that institutions can do. The second way in which these legal developments have shifted our understanding of affirmative action is the way that it gets implemented. And the technical term is that it needs to be narrowly tailored means, meaning you can try to get to diversity, but you can only use race as one of many factors in that determination. And you have to think of diversity as very broadly defined, right, to include other groups as well, other kinds of diversity. So even with these restrictions in the legal developments around the policy of affirmative action, it's still constitutional, right? Even after all those challenges, the Supreme Court said, yes, we've restricted it, but it's still something that can be practiced by institutions. Yet states, that's a federal level decision. States still have the right to ban the practice. And they have done so through state ballot initiatives and other measures. So currently we have 8 states that ban the practice. The first in California with Prop 209. And this is just a visual of those states. And so public institutions, public post-secondary institutions in these states have to use what are called race-neutral means in admissions, or race-neutral admissions. They can't necessarily look at race as one factor of many. And there's been a lot of research trying to understand the impact of these policies. And what the body of research shows, we can put it into 2 buckets. The first has focused on what's been the impact on the representation of students of color in various sectors of education. And they show consistently, with very rigorous quantitative methods that support causal inferences, that these policies have led to declines in the racial diversity of student bodies across a number of sectors, in undergraduate selective institutions, in law schools. My own work documents declines in graduate fields of study, as well as in medical school, which is a very important area for why we have racial diversity, which is a separate talk, so I won't go too much into that. The second body of work has shown that these bans have led to negative consequences, not just in the number of students of color, in the enrollment, what happens in admissions, that this influence, this negative influence, extends to other parts of the institution, to outreach and recruitment, to the work that has to happen to help support students of color through their experience after they're on campus. And Kelly Slade, she's now a postdoc at University of Maryland, has her dissertation focused on understanding the signals that these bans on affirmative action sent to students. And she found that it sends a message that it's a negative climate potentially at that institution, and that makes outreach and recruitment much more difficult for administrators. Some of my own work has shown that when you have these bans in place, it leads to silenced conversations on race by administrators who are in charge of supporting racial and ethnic diversity on campus. They feel less empowered to do that work. They feel like they have to make their efforts less visible. And we know that from other research that making those efforts visible is very important for supporting students of color on campus. And so despite this research showing the negative consequences, you still have institutions that may not be in states that ban the practice, but that have to deal with a legal environment, a political climate that makes it really challenging to still have race-conscious admissions. You have ongoing cases challenging the constitutionality of affirmative action. So 2 cases that are making their way to the Supreme Court, starting at the trial court. So we've got a case against UNC Chapel Hill, another case against Harvard University. We have recent announcements by the Department of Justice under the current administration that they're going to pursue claims of discrimination at places, at institutions that still have race-conscious admissions. And so when you have this climate, it makes it really difficult for institutions to stick to having race-conscious admissions. And so what some institutions have done, including my former institution, is they remain committed to having a racially diverse student body. But out of fear and perhaps in response to this climate, they have race-neutral admissions policies. And that was one of, so as I said, that was my former institution, Penn State University. And Penn State was established in about 1865 as a land-grant institution. They are heavily committed to having a racially and ethnically diverse student body. But in their policies for admissions, they do not consider race as a factor in undergraduate admissions. And so I was really wanting to understand what's been the influence of the university's response to these legal developments on the work of administrators who are in charge of supporting racial diversity on campus, right? To kind of understand what's been the broader impact of these developments beyond places that have to adopt race-neutral policies. What about those that choose to do so? And so that led me to this research question: how do institutional actors, those who are in charge of supporting and implementing policies that have to do with racial diversity on campus, understand the influence of developments around affirmative action and the university's response on their work in support of racial diversity? This question is informed by a theoretical framework, and I have two that apply to this study. So the first is bottom-up policy implementation theory. So this informs how I design the study, the question that I'm asking. And this is a theory that captures the perspective of individuals on the ground, those who are implementing the policy, who through their actions, their discretionary actions, end up giving meaning to the policy. So we understand the kind of influence, how that policy is shaped by how they understand it and apply it in their work. And so that informs why I'm asking, how do institutional actors perceive these developments on their work? The second theory informs how I interpret the findings. And I draw from Bonilla Silva's work on racism without racists to think about the ideology of colorblindness. So this is something that helps us capture the racial dimensions of discourse around race-neutral policies, right? Which is these requirements from the legal world, but also what institutions are choosing to do. And I argue that it's essential to have this in order to understand the targeted strategies that we have to implement to support racial diversity in an anti-affirmative action context. All right, so with respect to the participants, we interviewed 13 administrators total. They were about 8 female, 6 male. They worked at the institution for an average of about 16 years. At least 9 of them had worked there for an average of about 10 years. So it gives their length of tenure there, they can have a perspective of how their work used to be versus how it's now shifted in light of all these legal cases. You'll see that I'm not providing their racial and ethnic makeup. It was a racially diverse group, but I also promised them confidentiality, and it's a small number, and so just providing those characteristics might help reveal some of their identity. But 4 of them were high-level administrators. They worked at the level of the provost office, basically, president's office, provost office. About 3 of them were mid-level, so still university-wide, but not at the high provost president level. And 6 of them were those who were supporting racial diversity at the college level. So there's about 9 of them at Penn State, and they represented about 6 of those places. And we specifically targeted individuals who were in charge of supporting outreach, recruitment for students of color, and also their experiences once they were on campus. And all the interviews took place during the summer of 2016, a time when there was a lot of political turmoil, right? There was the presidential election was happening. The first decision in Fisher had been issued, but everybody was anticipating the second one after, in a very rare case, it makes it to the Supreme Court twice. All right, for the data collection. So I interviewed all the participants. We did open-ended, semi-structured interviews. Both of us, Darkhan and I, coded the interviews. We applied a priori codes, so those that we thought, based on our research question, our interview protocol, we're probably going to see coming from the data, things like definitions of diversity, understanding of legal developments, understanding of what it means to be race conscious. And then we also allowed other codes, other information to come from the data itself. And those things came up, things like deflect litigation, what it meant to be race neutral, so other things that just came up that we did not necessarily come with an understanding that we might see. And we both coded when there was disagreement. We went back to our definitions, making sure that there was consistency in our rater reliability, right? So then we also conducted document review, so institutional documents, to make sure that we triangulated our findings and that we understood the institutional context that participants were operating under. And then we took all that information, we brought it into kind of higher level categories to develop the themes that became the fun part of the presentation, our findings. So for findings, we found about 4 different themes. The first, in terms of how participants understood legal developments and the influence on their work, they described how these developments, the university's response, led to both an inclusive definition of diversity, yet also a watered down definition of diversity. So by inclusive, Courtney talked about how there was a broadening of and more inclusive definition of diversity. Martin talked about how it helped create a valuing within the community for groups that were often marginalized, right? So that we could bring in members from the LGBTQ community, veterans, international students, adult students who had come back after a period of time, students with disabilities, right? So it's kind of an inclusive definition. Yet you also had some other participants that talked about how this broadening kind of was watered down definition of diversity. So Milena talked about, for some people, the mental shift was difficult. There was a huge fear that if we go for multicultural or if we go for diversity, that we're watering it down so much that it becomes meaningless. Karen, diversity can be so many things to many different people that the thing is, it's always up for interpretation. And it's up for interpretation at convenience. So we had this first understanding of the ways in which understanding of diversity, how it's defined, has really shifted. The second theme that participants discussed was about this gradual erosion of race-conscious efforts. That these developments, the response has just kind of chipping away. And by race-conscious, they talked about being race-conscious requires it's being aware of the existence of race. Karen, it's a visible attribute. It can't be ignored. Nina says, it's just to know the skin that I'm in every day. They also define being race-conscious as having an awareness of racial inequality in society. Milena talked about how just understanding that the playing field is not level. Bridget talked about how being race-conscious and understanding structural inequities helps you see how academic indicators like standardized test scores can be racially biased. And finally, participants also describe being race-conscious as having this awareness that racial diversity improves the quality of education for all students, and it helps us understand each other. It leads to connection. So Martin talks about how racial diversity just makes for a stronger student body and graduates. And Bridget brought us to understanding racial diversity helps us relate to one another, engage with one another, appreciate one another. But participants described how these developments had chipped away at these race-conscious efforts. So Jonas says, an interesting thing about the court has been the gradual erosion of all those things that has been put in place as affirmative action. It's like you're in the pool of quicksand. You don't realize it. The next thing you know, you say, God, what happened? How did I disappear? In this metaphor of quicksand is one that parallels other participants' descriptions of legal cases as involving this continuous chipping away at race-conscious efforts. And another thing that Jonas mentioned is how when you don't have, in his words, a superstructure that supports racial diversity, then the legal developments become a force that just submerges those efforts, like a pool of quicksand. Karen was reflecting on how the kind of arguments that are brought in these cases they characterize race-conscious efforts as racial discrimination. She talks about how you make it very sophisticated by presenting this argument that a person is discriminated against because you're using a race-conscious approach. When you see the rationale, you say, well, you know, that can make sense to a lot of people. Yeah, it's not fair that somebody's discriminated against. And she talked about how opponents of affirmative action bring the assumption that everybody has the same opportunities. So having that assumption allows you to then equate classifications on the basis of race with just racial discrimination, and it becomes common sense that to be fair, we shouldn't be looking at race. So that's the second theme. The third is about this increased vigilance that administrators had to then maintain to just maintain the status quo. So it wasn't about advancing any work, it was just about keeping what they talked about as hard-won gains. So Sharon talks about how every time the language is rephrased, that change impacts your work. It's really hard to advocate for students of color when you're not supposed to be using that as a factor. Karen talked about how the very limited tools that you have to work with are changed in a way that you can see you're just not going to be as efficient or effective. And both participants and other participants actually used this one example of a scholarship that used to be available for just African American students. And having what in the legal world are called kind of race-exclusive scholarships became indefensible after the Grutter cases, the Michigan cases after 2003. Those had to be opened up for all students, and the criteria changed to having diverse populations as just one of the criteria for those scholarships. So we had this scholarship that went from being available for African American students to then having to be opened up to have criteria as diversity as one of the criteria. And participants talked about how their work was actually, after that, involved in working really hard to prevent that criteria from being removed from the scholarship in conversations. So the win ended up being maintaining the change that they saw as just even a hard-won gain. And when it came to this increased vigilance to maintain the status quo, we had Catherine talk about the Fisher case, because it was very much in the mind of people. They were waiting for that second decision. And she described it as, it's like a war. And the Fisher decision is one battle. And there are other little battles, and you can't let up. What Fisher then represented was a win that just maintained the status quo. But all the opposing side needs to do is have one win, and it ends affirmative action. So that's how they experienced all these developments. So the final finding, is participants talked about how they perceive the institution's response in adopting these race-neutral approaches in admissions as an effort to just avoid litigation. And when they talked about having this race-neutral admissions, they defined it as a very baffling and confusing concept. Milena talked about how people inevitably see color. They hear names that are hinting of one's race. Nina, race neutral is a crock because people are going to look at each other. They also described the concept as ahistorical. Jonas and Catherine both. It's totally ahistorical way to remove race from the picture when we are a race-driven country. And they also thought, well, it's this message that you don't see me, being race neutral. Bridget talks about if one does not see color, it sends the message to students of color that you don't see me. Other participants talked about it as a lack of action. If I'm neutral, I'm not moving forward, I'm not moving back, just still, not doing anything. And when they described the university's approach in doing this, Tyler says, we're mindful that whatever we do is probably going to come under a microscope. If done improperly, it could be a whole lot of noise for something simple. And Nina, I want to be fair. I'm not saying that the university hasn't taken chances, but it's always been a very careful institution. It's very conservative, and it will do anything that they need to do not to go to court, especially as it relates to affirmative action. So this effort to just avoid the threat, to deflect litigation, is what then leads the institution to have these policies that then end up having a much broader impact across other areas of outside admissions on the work of administrators. And so this kind of race-neutral, colorblind approach ends up taking hold in ways that we think, they're innocuous practices, race-neutral admissions. But then it translates, and it influences, and it affects the work of administrators in very important ways. So where do we go from here, right? What are some of the implications? So one of them, I think, is become really important to have diversity work that's done through what I call a race and racism conscious lens, right? To kind of do what needs to happen to maintain that race consciousness even as you're doing diversity work that moves you slightly away from that focus, right? So training, understanding, awareness of how structural inequities shape opportunity by race, particularly for individuals when you're making admissions decisions. To not have standardized test scores be what drives the merit, the consideration of whether somebody's qualified. But that's a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of broader understanding of how the structural inequities, the lack of access to quality education or networks can really influence performance on those tests, how the tests themselves are racially biased. Another part here is understanding how implicit biases, white privilege, can actually shape interactions among students, among administrators. And that's very important understanding when we think about supporting cross-racial dialogues, right? So how can we do, that's the challenge, how can we do diversity work through a lens that is race and racism conscious? The second is the importance about countering these dominant narratives and distorted narratives about racial discrimination, right? We have to address the racial ideology of colorblindness, in other words, right? To build, help, and that racial ideology comes with, this assumption that everybody has the same opportunities, right? That it's common sense that, to be fair, we shouldn't be looking at race. Well, let's build a counter narrative to that ideology that reclaims a definition of fairness, right? And understanding that opportunity is not equal, and that actually, to be fair, we have to help level the playing field. But part of that also involves developing our fluency, our language, our actions, in understanding how racial inequity is maintained. And that's challenging. So that's another area of efforts that need to happen. And then finally, helping deconstruct these legal fictions that conflict with racial diversity work. Having been trained and worked in the legal arena, there is a lot of legal fiction in the legal world, right? This idea that something can be race neutral is one of those. It has a very technical definition in the legal environment. So in the legal world, something's race neutral when, in language or intent, it does not confer an individual benefit, and by that meaning admission or scholarship, to someone based on race or ethnicity. Even that definition is, what does that mean? But that's the technical definition, right? Even benefit, it can't just be, it has to be something tangible, right? Admission, financial aid. What does it mean? Well, anyway, so that's the legal definition. But as we heard from participants, they had a really hard time understanding whether you could even be race neutral, right? They're navigating this imposed definition from the legal world with their understanding of whether you can be race neutral. According to Nina, it's a crock. So when, take the top 10% plan, for example, right? So we call it in the legal arena kind of a race neutral plan. But we know that to the extent that it helps yield racial diversity in admissions, it's because it's based on the racial segregation that we have present in K-12, in the K-12 education system. So there's racialized dimensions to that plan. And so administrators need to kind of do a both and, right? Understand those legal definitions, but also operate with an understanding of the racialized dimensions that those so-called race-neutral policies carry with them. And that's something that they need support to be able to do. And one of the things that came up from our interviews was that participants were actually really hopeful in the institutional messages that they received. They had trust in the president, that he cared authentically about racial diversity. And even though we didn't have the opportunity to understand how that message actually translated in their everyday practice, they did talk about how it helped empower them, that it sent a signal that their work mattered. So that's an important part about what the institutional messages are that can help deflect some of these negative consequences of policies that are so-called race neutral. So that's where I end. And let's open it up for questions and discussion. Yes.
I love this, of course. I am curious, though, about how you were able to recruit participants, particularly with the sensitive nature of the topic. And on one end, did whatever interest that the participants have sway their responses? And was there an opportunity to get other responses that may not have been in alignment with,
Yeah, no, it was tricky, and that's...
And then, like, you have some with the topic, or...
Mm-hmm. And it's one of the limitations of the study. So one, I was pleasantly surprised, and it was just wonderful that we had most people agree to interview. We had several who declined for reasons that it was either outside their area or they recommended speaking with someone else. But one of the limitations that we name in the article is that it's possible that participants may not have said everything they wanted to say for fear of being critical of the institution. Yet I found that they were pretty forthcoming and really invested in wanting to understand how they could help support racial diversity work even as they were struggling with the shift. James.
So it sounds to me like the definition of race neutrality, the technical definition that hinges on intent and language, does that leave out the sort of the consequential aspects? Like do in being race neutral, do universities actually achieve race neutrality in practice?
Yeah, well, that's assuming that there is a race neutrality to be achieved. But yeah.
Let's skip the race neutrality piece, right? Do universities evaluate whether or not their admissions decisions are in practice racially discriminatory? Are the admissions officers there looking at the consequences of the decisions that they make, given the information that they're able to evaluate?
That's a great question. I didn't speak with people in admissions in particular, but when we think about what is racially discriminatory, that's right. What does that mean when we have a broad understanding of structural inequities? Right. Reliance on standardized tests is racially discriminatory. That's from a race-conscious lens of understanding how you might be doing the work. But it's really hard to maintain that understanding when you're also trying to be race neutral in light of the university's policy.
What I'm trying to get at is, I guess, is there an opening for a challenge to race neutrality by arguing that the consequences of that policy are in fact discriminatory?
That's probably the next stage of challenges after these current lawsuits. And that would go back to, let's say, the top 10% plan,
Yeah,
right? Where it's framed as being race neutral, right? It's not what was challenged in the most recent decision or case, yet it can still be open to challenge that in fact is not race neutral. It just takes us down that road where even what you thought was legal permissible all of a sudden becomes not. And that's the irrationality of having these legal developments really shape the work of universities and what they're trying to accomplish.
Give me some good ideas here. No, so it might connect to your question.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking about the movement right now, particularly at the K-12 level, for ethnic studies. I don't really see that too much happening at the higher education level. So, I mean, this is like a contextual factor. So, partly I'm asking if anybody even spoke to, well, if we were really going to be proactive about addressing issues of race, well, dialogues are important and leadership is important, but curriculum is the reproduction of consciousness. So, you know, why wouldn't we have in universities a requirement to have ethnic studies taught as part of the gen ed preparation, for teachers, for anyone going into any career these days. So, I mean, maybe it could even be staged to where that would be part of like a political context in which clearly race neutrality is a scam, right? It's not even true because the intentions of administrators are tested, and theoretically, hypothetically, they cave in to pressures from below to to maintain what they see as the status quo, right? And so I'm thinking there could be a number of ways to kind of set up universities, if you will. I mean, with the climate, the political context, by presenting such challenges of those. But a lot of things have to fall into place for that to happen. But I think we're getting there. I think we are getting there. I think there's really important conversations and data at the K-12 level. Maybe there's other ways to set up, in quotation marks, to set up universities to prepare for next generation affirmative action challenges.
Yeah, and that relates to, I think, the kind of implications for policy and practice about implementing diversity policy in ways that infuse a race and racism conscious understanding, and having that work informing the curriculum to bring in ethnic studies is one way to do that, because that's something that would not, well, no, let's stop there. And that would also help build this counter-narrative, right, to understanding racial discrimination in a less distorted way.
Yeah, I was actually interested about your sampling process for choosing the, I believe, 13 administrators, particularly within the context of race-conscious admissions. Obviously, depending on who you talk to, you may have I'm assuming you have a very different story of what they think of the institution and their approaches to creating a more diverse student body or whatever. So I guess I'm just really interested in learning more about how you got to interview those 13 administrators.
Well, and we really specifically targeted administrators outside admissions, of wanting to capture, to contribute to the kind of second, I can get there, body of work, some presentation, so there we go, that is contributing more to this body of work, right? Understanding the influence outside admissions, because so much of the research has focused on, well, in admissions, what are the implications of these policies, right? But in fact, it's extending to other areas of the institution. And so this is really a more emerging body of work that this study is contributing to understand the work of administrators who are in charge of implementing, of shaping and creating policy that's outside of admissions, that relates to making financial aid decisions, to the kinds of programming that needs to happen to support students on campus, might even connect to curricular choices, or how to understand how we can support faculty in supporting this work. So all the other areas.
All right, thank you for your talk.
Thanks for being here.
So here you talk about how administrators feel disempowered. Have you found that within these, changes within the legal landscape, there is an increased turnover within administrators now that they have to essentially fight for these type of programs that support underrepresented minority students, that they are in charge of supporting themselves?
Mm-hmm.
What's the burnout factor look like for them?
Yeah. Well, I can't say overall for others, but one of the things that did come up in the interviews was feeling really, I don't know, burnt out is probably one of the right words, but just deflated, I think. Deflated, thank you. I was trying to think of, just deflated and needing, and especially after you had the first Fisher decision, knowing that I was going back to the Supreme Court again, anticipating that it might be a negative outcome, right? This idea that Catherine talked about, how it's a war, right? It's like all these little battles. Even if you win the case, it's just one small battle in a larger war, whereas the other side just needs this one win and that's it. Door closed. Even though it's a small door right now, not as big as it used to be. So that was something that, kind of the end of the interviews we talked about, what helps sustain you in this work? And a lot of it has to do with just knowing the difference that you can make in the students themselves, other people working on it, those institutional messages. Yeah.
You were talking about the 8 states that had a banned practice of affirmative action. They went to race-neutral procedures, and I've heard of similar kind of top percentile plans in some of the states you mentioned. I was just wondering if there were other plans that didn't necessarily use like a K-12 segregation law, as like the way to kind of skirt the within the other states you mentioned, like Michigan or New Hampshire, or that you pointed out. I mean, are they the same as what Texas and California developed, or is there another model for race neutral?
Not to my understanding. I think given the level of racial segregation in K-12 schools in Texas, it's kind of like the model of how much racial diversity you might be able to yield based on the segregation that exists. And so to the extent that it's been effective, I think there's a question there when you look at the research as to whether that's been what's yielding the racial diversity, or if it's just a change in demographics altogether. So so no, it's, I think, a lot of work in trying to focus on socioeconomic status or having more robust measures of wealth, where it's not just about income but other sources. And that's what a lot of institutions are trying to figure out, is how can we get there without being able to use race directly. If I had maybe a slightly different presentation, at one point in this slide I did have a third body of research documenting the effectiveness of so-called kind of race-neutral alternatives, and most of the research there shows that it is just not as effective when you can't use race, that the best methods really end up combining race with other factors. Okay. And I think we're at time. Unless there's,
Well, thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming.